What's going on, guys? The Comics Kid 2099 here. Today I want to talk to you about the Green Hornet 66 meets the Spirit. This is a 5-issue miniseries from Dynamite Comics, written by Fred Van Lente, with art by Bob Q and Travis Lindham. And this is yet another version of the Green Hornet from Dynamite. I knew going into this one that this was going to be different from the other versions that I've talked about recently. This is based on the Green Hornet television series from the 60s that had Bruce Lee playing Kato. And I know very little about the television series. I've only seen one episode, and that was quite a while back. I know just enough to be familiar with the premise of the series, but if you ask me, hey, remember that one episode with that one character who did that one thing, I would have no clue what you're talking about. One thing that did catch me a little off guard with this story, compared to some of the other Green Hornet stories I've read, is the tone of the Green Hornet. He's played a little bit lighter here than any other version that I'm familiar with, and the one episode of the Green Hornet that I watched wasn't necessarily a comedic thing. If you watch anything from the 60s, like Star Trek or the Green Hornet or Batman, you're going to say, okay, these are kind of silly and goofy and they're of a time. But the difference between Star Trek and the Green Hornet and Batman was deliberately playing itself silly. It was deliberately trying to be a comedy. Star Trek was not. And from what I know about the Green Hornet, it wasn't either. It was more of a serious show at the time, and then now we can look back on it and say that's kind of quaint and it's nowhere near like what we have today, or whatever. Maybe you prefer what they had back then. But this kind of plays the Green Hornet and Kato a little bit sillier than what I have seen of the television show, which is admittedly just one episode. So maybe later on in the series it did get a little sillier, but this is not exactly what I was familiar with from the television show. Now, I was more or less okay with it because the jokes that we have here are pretty funny. There's one point where the Spirit in this book, he talks about how he was able to track Britt and Kato because he put a tracker on Kato, and Britt laughs and says, this time I wasn't the one who screwed up, because in Green Hornet Year 1, there's kind of a joke about how if anyone screws up, it's going to be Britt, and that's how I've kind of always seen the Green Hornet and Kato dynamic, is that Kato is the more competent fighter. So we have a joke here where Kato is kind of the one who messed up a little bit, or didn't catch that there was a tracer on him, didn't necessarily mess up. But the tone here is a little different from what I am familiar with the Green Hornet, but it didn't bother me too much. It didn't take me out of the story too much. I do love the idea here that the Spirit is a legacy character. I have always been interested in that idea. I've always said that if you're going to do these pulp heroes, you need to put them in the time period that they existed in, and if you want to move them out of that time period, you need to age them properly. And this does that. This is working with the TV show version of the Green Hornet, so he's not active in the 1930s like I would like him to be, but this is that version of the Green Hornet meeting the Spirit, who is a character from the newspaper comics of the 1930s. And this is set 30 years after his adventures, and so this is aging him accordingly, and I like that quite a bit. You can't really tell on this cover, but the Spirit is actually the Spirit's sidekick, Ebony. And I should also mention, I know next to nothing about the Spirit. I have seen the movie, and that felt like a Frank Miller movie. I don't know anything about the Spirit outside of that movie. I think maybe he showed up in a while back, before the New 52, DC had this thing called First Wave, which was taking characters from DC Comics and teaming them up in a world with pulp characters like Justice Inc. and the Spirit. And so I think I read that. I vaguely remember reading that, but I don't know anything about the Spirit in his own solo adventures. But this is basically saying that his sidekick slash partner from the old Spirit comic strips, that he's now older and he has taken up the mantle of the Spirit. And one thing I like about any time you have Green Hornet team up with another superhero, Green Hornet's whole thing is that everyone thinks that he is a bad guy, but he's using that to his advantage to try and take out other bad guys. And so when another superhero is entered into the mix, they are going to think that the Green Hornet is a bad guy. And that provides an actual good reason for two heroes to actually get in a scuffle a little bit. Anytime you have two heroes who have never met before, they're going to get into a fight, and then they're going to realize it was all a big misunderstanding, and then they're going to team up and they're going to be friends at the end. And this book does more or less follow that model, not to spoil anything too much, but it provides a very good reason why this version of the Spirit is getting into a fight and doesn't entirely trust the Green Hornet. And the Green Hornet doesn't entirely trust the Spirit because he's not being very forthcoming with information about what's going on. So I like all of that. This is a 5-issue miniseries, and most of the issues here deal with the Green Hornet and the Spirit trying to stop this guy who calls himself Kid Kraken. He is I guess a kid sidekick who is now grown up. He was a kid sidekick of the Octopus, who was a Spirit villain that, again, I'm not familiar with. He was in the Spirit movie, but I don't know how faithful that was to the Spirit comic strips. But Kid Kraken is the adult kid sidekick of this villain that the Spirit fought back in the day. And these two are trying to stop him from doing his thing. Most of the issues here deal with Kid Kraken. There is one issue, I think it's issue 3, that really doesn't have anything to do with anything else in the book. Pretty much everything that has to do with the Green Hornet looking for the whereabouts of the Spirit and the new Spirit kind of trying to thwart him from doing that, and they're also both teaming up to stop Kid Kraken. Anything that has anything to do with that, I like. But then there's one issue here, I think it's issue 3, where this spaceship comes back down, and it has nothing to do with Kid Kraken. I was confused why it's in this miniseries. Basically, there's this bad guy, he was in debt, and he had financed several spaceships that had failed, and so he sabotaged his latest spaceship so that he would not be blamed for it failing and he could make his money back. That's the long and short of it, but it doesn't have anything to do with Kid Kraken. And they try to tie it into the Green Hornet investigating where the old Spirit is, and they say that this guy, he borrowed money from the Spirit, the old Spirit, and his organization. They try to tie it into with all of that, but it doesn't make any sense. And there's also this guy who back in the 1940s, he had this idea that the Nazis were going to win World War II, so he put himself into suspended animation, and then he wakes up in this World's Fair type situation where it's like, welcome to the world of tomorrow, that kind of thing. He wakes up there and he thinks, oh, this is the future, it looks wonderful. And his name was Hypnos Snooze. So it's a pun on like, oh, you know, Hypnos, falling asleep, snooze, falling asleep. But he doesn't really have anything to do with the rest of the story. He just kind of shows up here and there throughout the rest of the book, and it's hinted that he is the actual father of Kid Kraken. That he went into suspended animation and left his mistress pregnant and didn't let her come with him in suspended animation, and so this kid grew up without a father, and then he was taken in by the Octopus. I like that the Kid Kraken character is an orphan who was taken in by a bad guy, but I don't think you had to bring in Hypno Snooze and then play him for laughs. I don't think Hypno Snooze really needed to be in this book. I don't think the whole issue with the spaceship being sabotaged, I don't think that needed to be in the book. This could have been a 5-issue miniseries that is just about Green Hornet and the Spirit teaming up with each other to find and stop the Kraken, and the Green Hornet is also investigating the disappearance of the original Spirit. I think you could have done all of that, but this issue with the spaceship, it has some cutesy, clever little references to the Fantastic Four. I guess they're clever. You can pretty clearly tell these guys are supposed to be the Fantastic Four. They have similar names to the Fantastic Four, but that's not really enough to hang an entire issue on, I don't think. So I would give this book a B. I enjoyed it quite a bit. The art is fantastic. It reminds me of Nick Dragata's artwork, cartoony but also kind of rough. I believe Bob Q did the King's Quest miniseries, which was a team-up of various pulp characters like Flash Gordon, Mandrake the Magician, and the Phantom. So if you're into these kinds of characters, you might be interested in that. And I loved his art here, so I'm going to be looking into him elsewhere. But overall, there were a few things in this book that I was like, why did you do that? I don't really understand. But they weren't really deal breakers. They brought down my enjoyment a little bit, but not enough for me to say that this is a bad book. I did enjoy this book overall. So those are my thoughts on The Spirit meets Green Hornet from 66. I hope that you guys liked this review, and if you did, be sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe, and I'll be back later on with another video. In the meantime, you guys have a great rest of your day. Catch you later.